Now, the 2 sessions, we will be dealing with ecology. The first session, we're going to be looking at some general overviews of population dynamics. And on the second part, we will be looking a little bit more on ecological relationships. Now, ecology. Ecology is basically the study of the relationships between living organisms and the environment. All of us have a view of ecology with respect to the environment, with respect to how we treat the environment. We will focus greatly on the relationships between living and non-living entities. If we look at the organization of an ecosystem from the bottom up, we see, first of all, that we have species, organisms. Organisms are grouped into populations. Populations are grouped into communities. And communities, as they exist within the environment, make up the ecosystem. Now, an ecosystem can be as small as a leaf on a tree or as big as the world and the biosphere as we know it. Now, one of the components of the ecosystem is the population. Now, we defined population as a group of organisms that exist within a given area. In understanding populations, we need to look at population dynamics. First of all, in population dynamics, we have growth. We have arithmetic growth versus exponential growth, and we will discuss this in a moment. We have different types of growth curves in a population. The J curve, the S curve, mixed curve. We also need to understand that when we measure the population, we're going to be looking at the growth rate, which is basically the difference between birth rate and death rate. Let's look at arithmetic growth versus exponential growth. If we are making automobiles, and we're making 1,000 automobiles every day, we can see that by day 4, we have 4,000 automobiles, and by day 25, we have 25,000 automobiles. In a population of Daphnia, which are water bugs, we see that Daphnia grow exponentially. The Daphnia will double every 4 days. Daphnia will double every 3 days, so that by day 4 we have 2,000, by day 7 we have 4,000, by day 10 we have 8,000, and so on, so that by day 25 we have 256,000 Daphnia. Now, this shows you the power of exponential growth. In a biological system with unlimited resources, we will have exponential growth. Here again, we look at the types of curves that we get with arithmetic and exponential growth. Look at the straight line that you get with the increase in the automobile production. Look at the J curve that you get with the growth of the Daphnia. Again, let's examine the types of growth curves for population. Now remember, the growth curve is greatly influenced by the growth rate. To your right, we look at a J curve. The J curve occurs in a population that has basically unlimited resources, and it keeps doubling exponentially. Now, of course, as long as the resources are there, this can happen. But in a practical sense, most populations reach their logistical growth curve. As you can see, the S curve. The S curve referred to as the carrying capacity of a given ecosystem. So generally, J curves will evolve into S curves. Now, in reality, we have a more complex relationships that often occur, in that dynamics are continuously changing so that a population will go up, down, up, down, up, down, depending on a number of variables. Let's look at R, which is the growth rate. If R is 0, the population growth will basically be a flat line. If R is above 0, you can see a curve starting to develop. If R continues to a high intrinsic rate, you can see the J curve evolving. Of course, if R is below 0, the curve actually goes down, indicating a negative growth rate and increase in the population per se. Now, so what are the factors that are influencing the growth rate? Certainly the carrying capacity, K, as we discussed before. Secondly, generation time, the time between one generation and another. Thirdly, the number of offsprings produced per reproductive event. All of us realize that a dog will produce half a dozen puppies. We produce one at a time, generally speaking, okay? Another factor that influences the growth rate is the gestation time, the time between conception and birth. And again, death rate due to disease and predators. And finally, factors that influence the growth rate will be available resources, food, shelter, water, and so on. So let's look at more detail at some of these factors that we just discussed. Let's look at the generation time. The generation time is the time that it takes for an organism to reproduce. Ecology, for example, takes no more than 20 minutes to double itself. The paramecium will reach maturity and then double within a day. The daphnia in a week. Housefly in a month. And as you can see, as you go up in the complexity of an organism, humans, of course, do not reach reproductive age until 15 or 16. So this is an interesting concept that we need to understand. If we look at organisms and populations in an ecosystem, we can separate them into two groupings. One is referred to as K-selected species, and the other we refer to as R-selected species. If we use elephants as an example of K-selected organisms and flies as an example of R-selected organisms. And let's look at the characteristics of K-selected species. First of all, the K-selected species, the population size is going to be dependent very greatly on the carrying capacity. Secondly, it's going to be influenced greatly by the density of the population. As the population increases, factors come into being that force the population to decrease. Populations of K-selected species tend to be relatively stable. They do not fluctuate. The organisms tend to be large, like elephants and humans. The organisms produce few offsprings, like humans and elephants, of course. And the organisms provide great care for the offsprings. Now, when we move to the other extreme, the R-selected species, it is just the opposite. The population size is only limited by the reproductive rate. Think of flies. If flies have the right material available, they will continue to grow and overwhelm the given ecosystem. Flies do not care how many are present in a given area, so they are not influenced by density. They are density independent. And the population is relatively unstable. In a given period, you'll see flies in a given area, and suddenly flies will disappear, all influenced by the resources that are available. So again, the organisms are going to be small, short-lived, produce many offsprings, and obviously provide virtually no care for the offspring. If we look at K and R selected species, and if we look at them by way of survivorship curves, we can group them into type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curves. All of us realize that if we look at a K-selected species, at a given time, we will find lots and lots of organisms of various ages. It is only the old that we start losing them over a very short period of time. So that the numbers of organisms that we find at a given age decrease greatly as the organisms get old. If we look at the type 3 selected species, which are basically selected, we see that initially we have lots and lots of young, and very quickly the young die off, and there are very, very few old. So to summarize, type 1 selected species produce few and die old. Type 3 selected species produce many and die young. Now, interestingly enough, if we now look at the survivorship curves for humans, we can illustrate why we fall into the type 1 survivorship curve. If we start with 100,000 people and we start looking at how many survive at a given age, notice that at age 10, 99,000 are still around. By the time someone reaches 30 years, 97,000 people are still around. And by the time we look at 70-year-olds, we have lost almost 25% of the population. In 100 years, almost 99% of the population is lost. So this basically illustrates the survivorship curve of humans and why they fall into a type 1 survivorship curve. So let's look at the human population with respect to the not survivorship curve, but with respect to the growth curve. Now, if we look at the human population going back 10,000 years, we see that there were very, very few humans. And as we trace the population, we can see the major events that occur in the evolution and the growth of humans. We see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We can look to all the way to the right and see the population drop that took place during the bubonic plague. The reality is that it is only in the last few hundred years that the population has grown drastically. Now, what does this look like to your right? It certainly does have the appearance of a dramatic J curve. Now, we have reached this dramatic J curve because we have eliminated disease, we have increased our ability to provide food. Basically, we almost resource unlimited. And when resources are unlimited, population will grow exponentially, as you see to your right. Now, what is going to happen? What's going to happen over a period of time is that this population has to drop off. And it will through potentially disease, war, famine, and so on. When the population reaches the carrying capacity, it has to move to a S curve or perhaps drop down drastically.